The cold didn't come in bursts. It lingered. It seeped into her thin clothes, settled into her bones, and never left. It was a cold that made no sound, only occupied space. Her back was hunched, her shoulders raised, as if she could diminish her own presence. Her knees were pulled against her chest, her feet barely feeling the ground. The wood beneath her body had an old dampness, and the dampness rose slowly, as if searching for her skin. She breathed shallowly, not by conscious choice, but by instinct. The air made a sound as it went in. The air made a sound as it went out, and there were places where sound was an invitation. At some point, the body learns to conserve even that. Mouth closed, throat dry, chest holding back movement, as if each breath could be heard by someone who shouldn't hear it. There was a silence in the hallway, a silence that didn't feel empty. It wasn't the silence that comes when things are peaceful. It was a heavy silence, full of things kept hidden, full of footsteps that hadn't yet been heard, full of voices that could be heard at any moment, the kind of silence that made the heart beat faster with shame, because even the heart itself seemed excessive. She expected screams, not because she was imagining them, but because that's what almost always came. The expectation wasn't an idea in her head. It was a memory in her body. The sound of a door opening could be the beginning. A boot stopping on the wrong side could be the beginning. A name said in a different way could be the beginning. Screams, punishment, humiliation. Her body recognized these paths without needing a sign. It was as if she had walked them before, too many times. Beside her, other women were in the same position, each in their own attempt to disappear. No one asked anything. Asking was a risk. Answering was a risk. Even the gaze seemed like something one learns to control, because a look could be interpreted as a challenge, or as a request, or as something that no one had the right to ask for there. She kept her eyes downcast, but saw out of the corners of her eye. She saw the slow movement of a trembling hand. She saw a piece of cloth being pulled to better cover a wrist purple with cold. She saw a strand of hair stuck to someone's forehead, dark with old sweat, and she thought, without wanting to think, that even sweat had become scarce. Everything was scarce, even the will to move. Time didn't pass as before. It repeated itself. There was a before, a during, and an after of small things. Before, a door opened. During, the sound of footsteps. Afterward, when the body still didn't know if it could relax, or if it should remain ready for the worst. She lived in that interval, in that place, where nothing was happening, and yet everything was about to happen. The silence in the hallway didn't change. That was what was frightening. If someone were screaming somewhere, she could place the scream somewhere inside her head. She could say, "It's happening there." But when no one screamed, the fear was aimless. It was loose, searching for a place to land, and it always landed inside. She felt her own stomach clench, that small, constant pain that wasn't exactly hunger, but a reminder of hunger. A tightness that didn't hopefully ask for food. It only asked for the pain to stop. And, for a moment, she thought about how strange it was for her body to keep asking for things in a place where no one was attending to it. A distant sound appeared. Almost nothing. It wasn't a voice. It was metal playing metal, as if someone had carelessly bumped one object against another. The sound came and went, but it was enough to change the air. The silence for a moment became denser, as if everyone had held their breath at the same time. She didn't look up. Not yet. There were rules that no one needed to tell her. Looking too soon was like offering herself. It was like saying, "I'm here." And her body was trained to say the opposite, always the opposite. She only became aware of her own hand when she felt it gripping the fabric of her skirt tightly. Her fingers ached. But she didn't let go. Holding on to something gave her a false sense of control, as if it were possible to hold back whatever was coming. Out there, far away, existed a world where silence was rest, a world where waiting was just waiting. Their waiting was a way of being kept in place. She didn't know what would come when the door opened, but she knew what usually came, and knowing that was enough for her body to shrink a little more, as if it could protect itself by becoming smaller, smaller, smaller. The silence continued, and somehow it seemed as if it was being used, not as absence but as a tool, as if someone on the other side knew exactly what they were doing with the time, as if someone had learned that the worst thing wasn't to strike first. The worst thing was to make them wait. She was expecting screams, and all that existed, for the moment, was this silence, too heavy to be neutral. The uniform appeared before the man, a piece of stiff fabric, a color recognizable from afar, a cut the body learned to identify even before raising its head. There was no need to see the face. There was no need to hear the voice. That was enough. The body understood. It always understood. Her shoulders slumped a little more, as if the weight had suddenly increased. Her neck tightened, almost reflexively. There was no organized thought there, no complete sentence, just an old reaction, repeated so many times that it no longer needed a new reason. It was like an overtrained muscle, responding without being called. She felt her stomach tighten. It wasn't sharp pain. It was a rigidity, a preparation. The kind of preparation that doesn't expect victory, only damage control. Her body positioned itself in the safest place it knew, that of immediate submission. Not because she believed in this as a choice, but because she had learned that any delay could cost more. The mind came later. It always came later. First, the body adjusted itself, bent over, adjusted to the space as if asking permission to exist there. Only then did thought attempt to catch up, lagging behind, confused, trying to understand what had already been decided without it. There was a constant, silent shame clinging to her skin. It didn't stem from a specific act, but from the exposure, from being there, visible, observed, from knowing that every detail, her posture, the way she sat, the way she breathed, could be noticed, interpreted, used. Existing under constant observation was more exhausting than any sudden movement. She wasn't thinking about resisting. Resistance was too big a word for that space. There was no heroism in that calculation. There was only the practical certainty that resisting wasn't an option. Her body knew this before any conscious memory. It knew from previous days, from other times, from unforgettable sounds. The uniform moved a little further into her field of vision. One step, then another. Each step seemed to rearrange the air. It made the space smaller. It made the silence more attentive. She kept her eyes lowered, not out of formal obedience, but because looking directly could be interpreted as a mistake, and mistakes there rarely came with a warning. Her heart was beating erratically, but she was no longer frightened by it. The body also learns to accept its own lack of control. It learns that it's not worth fighting against everything at once. Some things are allowed to happen because there isn't enough strength to contain them all. She felt her breath become even shallower, a trickle of air going in, a trickle of air going out, just enough to keep going. No more than that. The sound of the uniform fabric moving was too clear. A dry, functional sound, unlike the sound of the bodies sitting there, which always seemed restrained, as if even the friction of the clothing was something to be hidden. There was no explicit hatred in that moment. There was something colder, something more organized, the feeling that this fear had already been foreseen, that it was part of the order of things, as if the space had been built counting on this reaction. on this automatic shrinking, on this silent shame. She didn't need to understand who he was. She didn't need to know his name, his exact role, his history. The uniform was enough to activate everything that came with it. Submission wasn't a conscious decision. It was a conditioned response, installed gradually, reinforced day after day. And while he remained there, still saying nothing, she felt this certainty growing within her. No matter what was asked, her body was already ready to obey, not out of loyalty, not out of agreement, but because surviving in that place meant recognizing too quickly that there was no room for choice. Fear no longer needed explanation. It was complete, even before a single word was spoken. The voice came slowly. Few words, short, direct. There was no explanation in them, nor a raised tone. That was precisely what made everything heavier. Long orders usually provided clues. They warned of what was coming next. This one warned of nothing. It took her a second longer than she would have liked to understand that it was about her. That second seemed dangerous. Her body reacted before her mind could organize the sentence. Her hands moved, uncertainly, as if searching for the correct gesture in an old repertoire of possible mistakes. Getting up too slowly could feel like a challenge. Getting up too quickly could feel like panic. There was an exact point in between, and nobody ever explained where it was. She tried to find it by instinct, by what had gone least wrong before. The ground seemed farther away when she shifted position. Her legs were heavy, not from ordinary tiredness, but from that accumulated fatigue that makes the body doubt itself. Each movement was accompanied by the feeling that it could be the last acceptable one. After that, anything could be interpreted as a failure. She didn't ask anything. To ask meant admitting she didn't understand. And not understanding, there, was dangerous. Misunderstanding was too. But there was a silent hierarchy of risks, and remaining silent still seemed the least of them. The space around her changed shape when she obeyed. Not physically, but in the way it was perceived. As if the air had become narrower, as if every inch now had an owner. She felt it, in the way she adjusted her feet, in the excessive attention to her own elbows, in the constant attempt not to occupy more than was absolutely necessary. The order had already been given, but the threat remained. It wasn't in the sentence. It was in what hadn't been said, in what remained suspended after the words. In the fact that there was no guarantee that obeying would be enough. She carried out what was asked with excessive care. The kind of care that comes from learning that a mistake doesn't have to be big to be punished. Sometimes the mistake was simply existing in a wrong way on that specific day. Her entire body was focused on anticipating the next sound, the next gesture, the next command. Obedience at that moment wasn't about trust in authority. It was a familiar form of self-protection, an attempt to mitigate the unpredictable. She felt her own face burning, not from fever, but from that mixture of fear and forced attention. Her heart continued to race, but she kept her outward appearance as neutral as possible. Showing nothing was also a learned skill. Nothing in the order indicated what would happen next, and that was the most significant factor, because when there's no described consequence, all possibilities remain. The body knows this. The body works with possibilities that are too broad. She finished what was asked, and stood there, unsure whether she should return to her place, wait for another command, or remain exactly as she was. The silence that followed the order seemed even denser than before. She chose not to move. She chose to wait. Waiting there was almost always the least wrong choice. Obedience had been fulfilled, but the threat was still there, lingering in the space between one breath and the next. After the order, nothing followed. No new words, no clear gestures, no sounds to indicate progress or retreat. Time seemed strangely suspended, as if it had lost its normal function of moving forward. She remained motionless because that's what her body did when there weren't enough instructions. Moving without permission could be interpreted as a mistake. Staying still could be too. But her body chose paralysis as the known option. To stop, there was a way to stay alive. The seconds began to stretch out, not as numbers, but as a sensation. Each breath seemed to last longer than the last. Each heartbeat seemed too loud, even without making a sound. She tried to slow down internally, as if that could make time less visible. The silence began to hurt, not physically, but in a persistent way, occupying everything. It was an active, attentive silence. It wasn't an absence of action. It was contained action, as if someone were observing exactly how long she could endure, waiting without breaking down. She thought little, but her thoughts always returned to the same places. There was no room for long-term imagination, only small repetitions. What if now? What if later? What if this is part of something bigger? Short, circular thoughts, without a way out. Hope didn't enter into this movement. It demanded too much energy. The body began to complain about simple things. The position of the feet, the tension in the shoulders, the weight of the arm hanging uncomfortably. Small things that, outside of that place, would be adjusted without thinking. There, each adjustment needed to be negotiated with fear. Was it worth changing? Or was it better to endure? She felt a slight tremor begin in her legs. It wasn't just cold. It was accumulated exhaustion, mixed with constant alertness. The kind of tiredness that doesn't come after the effort, but during the waiting. Waiting was more tiring than acting. The uniform was still there, but it didn't move. That was almost worse. If there had been movement, she could have reacted to it. She could have adjusted her body, prepared herself. The absence of movement left everything undefined. The undefined was the space where fear grew uncontrollably. She realized she was counting time without numbers. She was counting by breaths, by heartbeats, by the growing discomfort in her muscles. Each unit was a reminder that she was still there, that nothing had happened, and that this, in itself, was a form of control. Nothing happened, and that was the worst part, because when nothing happens, the body doesn't know when to stop preparing. It gets stuck between before and after, without permission to relax. The mind tries to keep up but gets lost. Everything becomes concentrated in that narrow interval where anything is still possible. She swallowed hard, feeling her throat scratch. Even that small movement seemed too loud inside. The silence around her remained undisturbed, as if maintained on purpose, as if someone had learned that prolonging the wait is more exhausting than any abrupt gesture. Her body was tired, but she wouldn't allow herself to give in. She was alert, but without a clear direction, trapped between anticipation and paralysis, not knowing which of the two hurt more. Time kept passing, but it took nothing with it. It only made everything heavier. The movement was too small to announce anything. There was no change of tone, no hurry, just a short, almost functional gesture, something that elsewhere might go unnoticed. Not there. It took her a while to recognize what she was seeing. Not because it was complex, but because it didn't fit. Her body expected another sequence. It expected the next curt command. It expected the voice to rise. It expected the harsh correction. When that didn't come, there was a strange emptiness, as if her mind had stumbled. The gesture didn't match the role she knew. It carried no visible threat. It didn't demand an immediate reaction. It was too simple for that place, and that's precisely why it seemed suspicious. Her body didn't relax. On the contrary, it became more alert, as if something was still hidden. She felt the confusion growing, slowly. It wasn't relief. Relief would come later, if it came at all. This was disorientation, the difficulty of trusting when everything before had taught her the opposite, when every pause used to be just the interval before something worse. The muscles remained tense, even without a clear reason. Breathing remained shallow. The body didn't know how to respond to an absence of violence. There wasn't enough memory for that. There was no training, just a strange space where the usual reaction was useless. She tried to read the face before her, but she didn't find there what she usually found. There was no hurry, no satisfaction, no explicit irritation. This left her even more lost. It was easier to deal with the familiar harshness than with that unexpected neutrality. The silence had changed in quality. It hadn't become lighter, but it had become different, less threatening in a way she couldn't name, as if something had been interrupted midway, as if the usual logic had failed for a moment. She didn't move. She didn't thank him. She didn't react at all, not because she was incapable, but because any reaction seemed wrong. Showing surprise could be interpreted as weakness. Showing nothing could be interpreted as well. The confusion offered no clear instructions. The shock didn't come as a strong emotion. It came as a delay, as a mismatch between what the body expected and what was happening. It was difficult to know what to do with it. Difficult even to realize that something had, in fact, changed. She remained there, trying to maintain her previous size, posture, and care. But something had already shifted. A small fissure in the predictable sequence of events. Not large enough to bring security, just enough to cause unease. Nothing had been explained. Nothing had been promised. Yet that moment made no sense within the context of the war she knew. And because it didn't make sense, it hurt in a new way. It was something minimal, so small that if recounted later, it might sound like nothing. There was no announcement. There was no explanation. Just a discreet, almost technical act of care, executed without haste or fanfare. A movement that didn't seek approval. A gesture that didn't seem to want to be seen. It took her a while to understand that it had already happened, that the expected continuation wouldn't come, that the moment of impact had passed without any impact at all. Her body remained suspended, as if she had lost her footing for a second, not from a fall, but from the absence of the push that always came. The authority was there. That hadn't changed. The power, too. But at that specific moment, there was a different choice. Not to advance, not to explore, not to use the available fear. The choice was silent, almost invisible, and precisely for that reason, difficult to believe. She felt something strange in her shoulders. A brief involuntary loosening, a relaxation too small to become relief, too great to be ignored. Her body responded before she could stop it. For a second, just a second, the tension eased. There were no kind words. There was no apology. There was nothing that could be interpreted as clear kindness. Yet, dignity was preserved there, in that short space, without speeches and without witnesses, as if someone had decided, for a reason she would never know, not to cross a line. She didn't know what to do with it. The war had taught her to react to cruelty. It had taught her to anticipate the worst. It hadn't taught her how to remain whole in the face of minimal care. The body had no memory for that kind of interruption. She remained quiet. She didn't thank him. She didn't immediately change her posture. Part of her suspected that any reaction could undo that moment, as if showing perception were a risk, as if it could only exist as long as it remained unnamed. The gesture was over, but the effect lingered, reverberating slowly, not as hope, not as a promise, simply as a rupture. Something in the predictable sequence of events had been broken, even if only briefly. She felt her heart slow down a little. It didn't return to normal. It just came out of its acute, erratic state. Her breathing found a less defensive rhythm. Her body, incredulous, tested this new state like someone treading on unstable ground. Nothing guaranteed that the next moment wouldn't return everything to its previous state. Nothing ensured continuity, yet that small act had occurred. And having occurred, it could no longer be erased. The logic of war had been interrupted for an instant, too brief to change the world, but enough to change that second. And in that second, her body learned something it had never learned before. Not all authorities choose to move forward. Not all silence hides violence. Sometimes what doesn't happen leaves a deeper mark than any visible aggression. She remained there, feeling her own body trying to figure out what to do with it, trying to return to its previous state, but without fully succeeding. Something had happened to her, small, almost nothing, and yet impossible to forget. Then there was no clear closure. There was no final sentence. The moment simply ended, like so many others inside. Her body was returned to waiting, but not exactly to the same place as before. Something had remained. It wasn't a strong visual memory. There was no striking image to retain. What remained was a feeling, a bodily memory, one of those that doesn't ask permission to return. Stronger than any visible wound, more insistent than any old pain. The kind of memory that appears without warning, in other silences, in other times. In the following days, she tried to reconcile what she already knew. She tried to treat it as an exception, as a mistake, as a coincidence, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Whenever the silence lingered, whenever an order wasn't accompanied by what was expected, that crack would resurface. There was now a new difficulty, to reconcile the learned fear with the lived humanity. Not a grand, declared, heroic humanity, just a fragment, too small to erase what came before, too strong to be ignored. The war had taught clear rules, who commands, who obeys, what to expect, where one person's body ends and another's power begins. That moment hadn't overturned those rules, but it had shown that they weren't absolute, that even there, someone could choose not to go all the way. She didn't come to trust. She didn't come to expect kindness. Fear remained the foundation of everything, but mixed in with it, there was now a silent question, a small, uncomfortable space where before there had only been certainty. Nothing visibly changed. The cold continued. The hunger, too. The silence became heavy again. Still something had shifted inside, not as a promise of salvation, just as silent proof that war sometimes fails to erase everything. When she remembered that moment, she didn't remember the gesture itself. She remembered what didn't happen, the scream that didn't come, the punishment that was suspended, the advance that was interrupted without explanation. That's where the memory lingered, not in the act itself, but in its absence. The silence after that was never quite the same again. It was still menacing. It still demanded caution, but it carried, hidden somewhere deep within, the reminder that not all silence ends the same way. And that did not bring peace. It did not bring security. It brought only the strange feeling that, even in the most controlled space, war did not have the last word at that specific moment. Her body moved on, as it always did, one day after another, one weight after another, but somewhere silent inside her, that second remained. Still, without explanation, no closure, and perhaps for that very reason, impossible to erase. Some people move on, others stay a little longer. The stories continue here for those who choose to stay.